The Suzuki DR350SE is a legendary bike. It's my first dual sport, so it has a special place in my heart, but I honestly believe that this is a great bike regardless of whether it was my first dual sport or if I didn't even own one. I want to hear what you think down below, but first here's why I like this bike so much, and let's get into the actual review. The Suzuki DR350 is a dirt bike and dual sport that Suzuki made in the 90s. My bike is a 1999 DR350SE, the crown jewel of this bike, since it came with some desired features that I'll get into shortly. As you probably guessed, the bike is a 350cc class dirt bike that was made for the woods or as the dual sport machine, which is what I have. Since mine is the street legal version, that is what this video is going to focus on, but there are a lot of similarities between the off-road bike and the street legal version. Let's begin by going over the specifications of this bike. Now, in my opinion, specifications are highly overrated because to me it's how the bike or car makes you feel and how it actually rides or drives versus just the numbers on paper. But since people love to hear about that in reviews, let's do that first. To start out, the DR350 is a 348cc single overhead cam air-cooled 4-stroke engine. This engine makes just shy of 30 horsepower, which is pretty decent, even though the bike is a little bit heavy compared to motocross bikes at about 286 pounds dry. Now, that weight, like I said, compared to motocross bikes, which I came from, is a decent amount more. But compared to other street legal dual sports, it's actually very competitive. To put it into perspective, the brand new Kawasaki 250 dual sport weighs about 300 pounds wet and the Honda weighs about 320 pounds. So you get 100 extra cc's with this thing and it weighs about the same. Obviously, those are water cooled, so they're slightly different than an air cooled engine like this, but I'll get more into that after. On later bikes, this engine was paired with a nice 6-speed transmission. On earlier ones, it came with a 5-speed. It has about 11 inches of front travel and 10 inches of travel in the rear. This is pretty soft, once again, especially compared to motocross bikes, but for a street legal bike and what this bike was really intended to be used for, it's not too bad. Do note that later model DR350SEs came with the more stiff dirt suspension, so I still think this suspension is fairly soft, and this is the stiffer suspension than the street suspension. Now, earlier bikes, like I said, will have super soft suspension if you get an on-road version, but depending on what you ride, it might not be a problem for you. It features front and rear disc brakes, and surprisingly, a lot of older bikes didn't come with disc brakes, especially in the rear, so that's nice, and it does have pretty decent stopping power. The seat height on this bike is about 35 inches, and I'm not super big. I'm about 5'7" and 135 pounds, and the bike feels pretty good for me. I'll get a little bit more into seat height later once we get into how this bike actually rides, but those are the main specs on this thing, and if there's anything I missed that you want to know, go ahead and look it up on Google and leave it down below to help other watchers out. Now let's get into the more important stuff, how this thing actually rides and behaves. As I mentioned earlier, this is my first dual sport motorcycle. Now, I had motocross bikes before. I used to have a mint condition YZ125 that was absolutely awesome for ripping fields and the occasional track day, even though I was never really that fast or anything on it. And I also had some purpose-built trail bikes. My dad had a KDX 220, which I would rip around, and I also had a TTR 230 as well as various smaller bikes before that. So that's sort of the background that I came from. Now, I bought this bike because I have tons of awesome terrain and tons of awesome dirt roads right near my house that I wanted to be able to just ride to, rip them up, enjoy it, and then just ride the thing home and not having to worry about trailering it to a place where it's legal to ride. Here in Connecticut, where I live, there's very few places where I could ride, so being able to have a dual sport and take it right to the trails was huge, and that's why I picked this bike up. Anyway, knowing why I got this bike and the bikes that I've came from, let's get into how this thing rides. Now, being a dual sport, I expected them to be some compromises between on-road and off-road, but to be completely honest, for what I use it for, it's perfectly fine. It does very decent on-road and really quite well in the woods, but let's start with on-road first. So, as I said, this bike is just under 30 horsepower, which is plenty to get you up and running on the road, especially if you're just riding back roads. If you want to ride highway, this thing is capable of doing about 90 miles an hour, but I wouldn't want to do that on a bike like this personally. So just on back roads, this thing has plenty of power and it's just an enjoyable time. Now, at 30 horsepower with longer gearing, so you can ride on road and go fast when you want to and when you need to, it's not crazy fast in acceleration. This means if you're cracking the throttle, the front wheel's not just going to be popping up on you in every gear and stuff like that. And it's certainly not a rocket ship. It's not a two-stroke race bike. It's not a big four-stroke race bike, but just to ride around on the road, it's pretty good. Now, I used to rip around on these same dirt roads on a Yamaha Zuma 50cc, and obviously that thing was slow, so this compared to that is plenty of power. Like I said, not a rocket ship, but it's plenty to get around on the road. The suspension for these DR350s is quite nice on the road. It's definitely a little bit soft, but on the road you're not going over crazy bumps and jumps, and it really does feel good to ride. Obviously, these bikes don't handle like sport bikes. They have dual sport tires. I have 50/50s on mine, which are fairly old, so they don't have tons and tons of grip, but handling is quite decent. It handles basically how you would expect it to handle. It's a 20 to 30-year-old trail bike that you could register for the road. Don't expect super bike performance and on-road handling that's gonna blow you away, but it'll get you from where you are to the trail without any problems on the road. Also, if you really wanted to commute and do longer road trips on this bike, I don't really see a reason why it would be a horrible idea, because like I said, it is a pretty comfortable ride. Now that we covered on-road, let's get into the reason why you probably bought a bike like this over just a street bike, and that is dirt roads and off-road. For dirt roads, this bike is absolutely awesome. Now that was the main reason why I picked this bike up. Right near me, I have freshly groomed dirt roads, I have no winter maintenance roads that are a little bit more rugged, and I have some roads that are abandoned and are really only used by people with dirt bikes and dual sports and Jeeps and other rock crawlers. So I get a wide variety of terrain with this, and it is pretty sweet. So on the no winter maintenance roads and on the smoother dirt roads, this bike is absolutely awesome. The suspension is definitely soft, but on roads like that, you're not going over crazy jumps and bumps, and it really just soaks everything up, and it is a nice, enjoyable ride. Also, being that it is 30 horsepower, on roads like that, you could crack the throttle, give it full throttle, and spin the tire in most gears on dirt. I mean, it's not a rocket ship, but on looser surfaces, yeah, it has power and it could spin the wheel. So that really is my favorite type of riding to do with this bike, and I really like it. It is a little bit heavy compared to motocross bikes, but compared to other dual sports, it's not, and on dirt roads and on the road, it really doesn't feel heavy, and it's a very enjoyable ride. Now let's move on to more technical stuff, which I also ride a little bit of with this bike, but not a ton of. Now with more technical stuff, that's when you start to notice the weight of the bike. Now for me in the woods, I'm not that big, and if I need to put a foot down, I could most of the time with this thing. If I'm going through super aggressive, gnarly rocks, once in a while I can't quite reach to get a foot down and really be comfortable with the weight of the bike, but I'm also fairly new to trail riding, and even though I did a lot before, it never was super aggressive stuff. So I would really say that's more on me than on the bike, and if you have a proper set of tires on one of these and the skill to rip this, it'll take you where you want to go over most terrain. In the woods and through technical stuff is where I found the biggest shortfall of this bike though. And that is that since it is a dual sport, it's geared to be able to go decently fast on the street, which means you compromise your low-end torque in the woods. For tight stuff, you really can't creep it super easy with stock gearing, even in first gear, and I would like it to be geared just a little bit shorter so I could have a little bit more torque and really just put over stuff in the woods without having to rev it up, slip the clutch, or go faster than I'm really comfortable with. Now, once again, if you're more experienced than I am, it probably isn't a problem, and I've only really found that to be a problem with the most technical rocky stuff that I've ridden, and for probably 95% of the stuff that I've ridden in the woods, the stock gearing is fine. Finally, I want to talk about jumping. Now, obviously, this is a dual sport bike that's made for trails and on the road, and like I said, the suspension is soft and the bike is heavy. So if you're buying one of these bikes just to jump it, probably look for a different bike. It'll do it, but you're going to be bottoming the thing out, you're not going to be able to throw it around in the air a lot, and it's probably just not really the bike for you. With that said, I've done very small jumps with it and it's enjoyable, but if I did anything bigger than what I did, I would just be bottoming this thing out like crazy, and I would really just want a motocross bike rather than something like this dual sport. That's not a problem at all though, because it's a dual sport, it's not a motocross bike. So to wrap up the riding impressions on this bike, this is a super versatile bike that will take you through all those situations that I just talked about and showed without any hesitation. It's not exceptional in every category, but it is a dual sport, so you're going to make compromises along the way. For ripping dirt roads and trails and being able to be a bike that you could just ride to those situations, it is absolutely awesome, which is why I bought this bike. It'll take you to where you want to go and you will have an absolute blast doing it. Before we wrap up this review, I just want to talk about a few other things with these DR350s and the DR350SEs. Now, the first thing that I want to talk about is the maintenance required on these bikes. This is another thing that I absolutely love about this bike, and the maintenance required is super low. Like I said, it's an old air-cooled 4-stroke, so it's sort of built like a tractor. There is no radiator and no coolant that you're going to have to worry about, so that's one less thing to break and one less thing to worry about. The maintenance schedule on these bikes is very spaced out. Basically, you could do oil changes and the occasional checkup on other things like valve clearances and just basic maintenance that you would want to do on any engine, and these things will run pretty much forever. Compared to something like a motocross bike that has much shorter service intervals because they're trying to just get a lot of power with not a lot of weight, this thing is just super easy to work on and it's great to own. It'll start up most of the time. One thing that a lot of people have trouble with is the carbs on these bikes. Now, I had to rebuild the carb on mine to get it to run right, and if you're not careful and you let old fuel sit in them or you run contaminants through them, they could get clogged up pretty easy, but that's the nature of most carbureted bikes, and it's not fuel injected like modern stuff. So that is a small drawback. Another thing, without getting into the engineering of it, is the on-road bikes came with a CV style carburetor. This means that they have less throttle response and worse throttle response than the off-road bikes, which came with a pumper carb, which is what they call them. The pumper carb is a TM33. The CV style carb is a BST33, and a lot of people convert the on-road carbs to the off-road model so you get the instantaneous throttle response when you crack that throttle. Now, I haven't ridden a bike with that throttle response because, to be completely honest, for what I do, this carb is fine. But if you want a little bit of extra performance out of your on-road bike, you could consider doing one of those carb upgrades. It's not crazy expensive, but to me, I just don't really want to put too much money into this, and I just want to keep ripping it and enjoying it as it is, because really, it is a great bike for what I want to do with it. So now to wrap up this review. The DR350 and the DR350SE is a 30-year-old design that is still great by today's standards. Being a 350, you'll have competitive power and competitive weight with the newer 250 bikes without the extra hassle of coolant and radiators and other things like that. Yes, they're a little bit more picky because they're carbureted and you need to keep up on that to not let that go downhill, but there really aren't a lot of drawbacks with this bike compared to a more modern bike. If you want to save some money and have almost the exact same amount of fun as if you got a new bike, I would look at something like a DR350SE, and I wouldn't hesitate to pick one up even in 2020 and beyond. With that said, I want to hear your thoughts about the DR350 and the DR350SE 350 down below. Leave any questions or comments about what I talked about in this video. Like this video if you liked it, and I hope you subscribe for more. I'll have plenty more DR350 SE content on the channel, along with tons of stuff for cars. So I hope you stick around for the next one, and I hope you enjoyed this.